December 17th, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. Lieutenant Lyle Buck is 20 years old today. That is not a figure of speech. This is his actual birthday, and he is spending it crouched in a snow-covered foxhole on a ridge above the Belgian village of Lanzerath, watching the fog. The fog is so thick he can barely see 10 FT in front of him, and somewhere in that fog he can hear something enormous, something moving. Buck has 18 men. 18. He is a reconnaissance platoon, not a combat unit. His job is to observe and report, not to fight. He has a handful of rifles, 2 machine guns, and a radio that keeps cutting out. What is walking toward him through that fog is an entire German battalion, 500 paratroopers, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad, part of the spearhead of the largest German offensive since D-Day. And here is what you need to understand before we go any further. Hitler had spent months planning for this fog. The entire German offensive, 200,000 men, 600 tanks, the last great gamble of the Third Reich, had been deliberately timed to launch on the day when a forecasted stretch of overcast weather would ground Allied aircraft for 2 weeks of thick cloud cover, low visibility and fog, for exactly this kind of morning where nothing can see more than 10 of full. The fog was Germany's secret weapon. Field Marshal von Rundstedt himself said it plainly. Weather was a weapon the German army used with success. The Germans had done the math. Take away American air power, take away visibility, strip the battlefield down to its raw infantry bones, and thick fog and snow. And Germany's experience, Germany's discipline, Germany's superior training would tell. The fog was supposed to be the great equalizer. Without air support, without the ability to see, the American advantage disappears. What happened instead is the subject of this video because something went catastrophically wrong with that calculation. In the fog, in the dark, in the frozen Belgian forests, the Americans didn't just survive. They dismantled Germany's most elite formations at Lanzerath, at Elsenborn Ridge, at crossroads no one has ever heard of. Small groups of Americans in zero visibility did something that German generals could not explain during interrogation. They did something that German officers in post-war interviews kept returning to with the same word over and over, unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. To understand what the Germans could not comprehend, we need to understand what they were betting on. And to understand that, we need to go back 16 years before the fog rolled in over the Ardennes to a German document written in 1919 by officers who had just lost one war studying why. Let's start with something that most accounts of the Battle of the Bulge bury in a footnote. Hitler originally wanted to launch the Ardennes offensive in November 1944. His generals talked him into waiting, not for more troops, not for more tanks. They waited specifically for the weather. The German Meteorological Service had identified a coming period of dense overcast, low cloud ceiling, and limited visibility expected to last from approximately mid-December through late December. Field Marshal Walter Model and the other planners were clear. Without this weather window, the offensive could not succeed. Allied air power had been absolutely devastating to German formations operating in the open. At Falaise in August 1944, Allied aircraft had helped trap and destroy an entire German army. At Mortagne, fighter bombers had turned back a German tank offensive within hours. The Germans had a name for the American Jobos, the fighter bombers. They feared them the way medieval armies feared plague. So the offensive waited for fog. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the weather report was exactly what they had prayed for. Solid overcast, fog in the valleys, low visibility across the entire Ardennes front. Allied aircraft were on the ground, engines cold. German meteorologists confirmed the overcast would hold for at least a week, possibly 2. Hitler called it Operation Herbstnebel, autumn mist. He named his last offensive after the fog itself. This tells you everything about the calculation. 200,000 German soldiers, 600 panzers, the last armor reserves of the Reich, everything that could be scraped together from a nation already losing on 2 fronts, all of it committed to a plan whose first and most critical assumption was, in fog, the Americans fight badly. Now ask yourself why a professional army, a general staff with brilliant men who had studied warfare for decades, would make that assumption. The answer is that the assumption wasn't unreasonable. In fact, it was historically accurate for almost every army that had ever existed because fog is not just weather. Fog is the destruction of information. When you cannot see, you cannot coordinate. When you cannot coordinate, complex combined arms operations break down. Units lose contact with each other. Artillery cannot observe its fire. Commanders cannot see what the troops are doing. The telephone lines get cut. The messengers get lost. The carefully rehearsed drills designed for daytime operation suddenly become impossible in zero visibility. Military history is littered with attacks that collapsed in fog, armies that walked into disaster because the fog stripped away their ability to function as a system. Here is what the Germans knew about the Americans in December 1944. They knew the Americans depended on air power. They knew American artillery was formidable, but they believed it required the ability to observe fire, to have a spotter with line of sight to the target calling in corrections. They knew American armor was terrifying in open country with clear skies. Strip all of that away with fog, force the Americans to fight as pure infantry in close terrain, and what do you have? You have, the Germans calculated, a nation that has been at war for 3 years compared to Germany's 30. You have a nation whose soldiers are largely conscripts and volunteers with 1 to 3 years of service compared to veterans who have been fighting since Poland in 1939. You have a nation whose military culture, product of a democracy, of civilians in uniform, had never seemed to German eyes to match the iron discipline and tactical ferocity of a Wehrmacht that had been bred for nothing else. The fog was supposed to strip the Americans of their technology and leave them fighting on German terms. Man against man, skill against skill, experience against inexperience. What the German planners did not know, what they could not know because no army in the world had built what the Americans had built, was that by December 1944, the American military had developed a system for fighting that did not require sight. Their artillery did not need to see the target. Their infantry could coordinate across miles of fog without seeing each other. Their combined arms operations were built on radio frequencies that cut through fog like it wasn't there. The Germans had planned for 2 weeks of zero visibility. They had not planned for an army that fought by mathematics instead of eyesight. But here is the detail that makes it even darker. The Germans were not operating blindly. They had studied American performance in the Hurtgen Forest. They had read the intelligence. They knew about it. War correspondent Ernest Hemingway, who was there, called it something simpler: Passchendaele with tree bursts. The Germans looked at the Hurtgen Forest and saw confirmation. Strip away American air power and armor. Force them into fog and dense terrain, and the American machine grinds to a bloody halt. They were not wrong about the Hurtgen. The Americans had indeed struggled terribly in conditions that negated their advantages. What the Germans did not understand was what had been happening on the American side during those same 6 months of misery, because the Americans had been learning. And the lesson they had been learning was not how to fight in fog. It was something deeper than that. It was a different answer to the same question the Germans thought they had already solved. How do you fight a war you cannot see? The German answer was Auftragstaktik, mission command. Train your officers to understand the commander's intent so thoroughly that when communications break down, they can act independently to achieve the mission. The German system was built for fog because it assumed communications would fail. It was an elegant answer to a genuine problem, and it had made the German army the most tactically feared force in the world. The American answer was different, and you will not fully understand it until you understand what a 35 lb radio backpack did to the fog of war. Let's talk about the SCR-300, the Signal Corps Radio Model 300 35 lbs, backpack-mounted FM frequency band 40 to 48 MHz, range under ideal conditions up to 8 miles, under combat conditions 3 to 5 miles of reliable voice communication. That is the technical description. Here is what it means in practice. In 1940, when German panzer columns were driving through France and the world was watching the Wehrmacht in awe, American infantry units communicating in the field were still largely dependent on telephone wire, messengers on foot, and AM radio sets that had been designed in the 1930s. The AM sets had a significant problem in combat conditions. They were susceptible to interference, static, noise from nearby engines, artillery, other radios. In the chaos of battle with guns going off and vehicles everywhere, AM radio communication was often reduced to garbled fragments. You might hear enough to catch a unit designation in a rough direction. You might hear nothing at all. In 1940, a Signal Corps engineer named Daniel E. Noble, working at what would become Motorola, conceived of using frequency modulation, FM, for infantry field radios. FM had been developed in the 1930s by Edwin Armstrong as a way to eliminate static in civilian radio broadcasting. Its military application was not obvious. FM sets were larger and more complex than AM sets. The frequency range required was considered impractical for portable equipment. Noble's team spent 2 years solving those problems. By spring 1942, they had a working prototype. They tested it at 8 miles apart, twice the required distance, crystal clear signal. The Signal Corps, watching the demonstration, called it outstanding. Production began immediately. The first SCR-300 units reached combat in Sicily in 1943. By the Normandy invasion in June 1944, they were standard equipment down to the company level. By December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans had fielded approximately 50,000 units across the European theater. Now here's the detail that changes everything. FM radio, unlike AM radio, does not degrade in fog, rain, snow, or night. The physics are different. The FM signal is resistant to amplitude noise, to static, to the kind of electromagnetic interference generated by artillery, by engine ignitions, by the general electromagnetic chaos of a battlefield. Where an AM radio in a heavy artillery barrage might reduce to static and fragments, an FM radio produces clear voice communication. In a snowstorm at 2 hours in the morning, with 1,000 artillery rounds going off around you, the Germans were using AM radios, not because they were stupid or behind in technology. They were in many areas ahead, but because they had built their communications doctrine around a different assumption. The German system assumed communications would break down and trained its officers to operate without them. The American system assumed communications could be made reliable and then built a doctrine that depended on that reliability. Think about what this means in fog. A German battalion commander in the Ardennes, December 1944, in dense fog and snow, has lost contact with his flanking units. His telephone wire has been cut by artillery. His radio operator is getting static. He falls back on his training. He acts on the last known intent of his commander. He does what Auftrag's tactic trained him to do. He improvises based on his understanding of the mission. An American battalion commander in the same fog, same night, same artillery, picks up his SCR-300 and talks directly to the artillery fire direction center 4 miles behind him in clear, intelligible voice. He tells them where he thinks the German column is. They call up the pre-registered coordinates. They calculate the time on target solution that will put shells from 15 different guns onto that grid reference simultaneously, arriving with no warning. The fog means nothing to this system. The fog, in fact, actually helps it, because when the Americans shoot in fog, the Germans cannot see where the shells are coming from. They cannot identify the gun positions to suppress them. They cannot observe the fall of shot to adjust their own fire in response. They are fighting blind. The Americans are fighting by numbers. But there was a second layer to this system that the Germans understood even less than the radio. And it was the layer that would produce the most incomprehensible results in the fog of December 1944, the forward observer. The American fire direction system required human eyes at the front, not to adjust fire. The mathematics handled that, but to identify targets, to call in the grid coordinates, to tell the distant guns where to shoot. That was the job of the forward artillery observer, a lieutenant or a sergeant attached to an infantry company right at the front line, with an SCR-300 on his back and a map in his hands. Think about what this man does in fog. He cannot see the target with his eyes, or barely so, but he has a map grid. He knows his own position on that grid. He has information from patrols, from sound, from muzzle flashes, from prisoners, from any source available about where the enemy is. He feeds that information into the grid reference system. He calls it in on the FM radio. The fire direction center computes the solution. The guns fire, And this is where the mathematics becomes something almost supernatural, because the American Fire Direction Center of December 1944 was not just connecting one battery to one observer. It was connecting 20 or 30 or 40 batteries spread across miles of terrain to any observer who called. Any observer could call in any target on the unified grid, and the FDC could mass the fire of an entire corps onto that target in under 3 minutes. From fog-shrouded hilltops, from snow-covered ridges, from ditches on the side of frozen roads, the German artillery system, by contrast, recognized by most historians as technically superior in many respects, required pre-plotted survey positions and deliberate calculation. An unexpected threat from an unfamiliar direction could take 15 minutes or more before German guns could respond effectively. In fog, that calculation required direct observation. Without observation, the German system was largely blind. The American system had been built specifically to function without line-of-sight observation. Now here is the piece of this story that should genuinely disturb you. The Americans did not build this system in response to the German fog plan. They built it 15 years before the Battle of the Bulge at a dusty Army school in Oklahoma on a budget so minimal that most of the U.S. Army establishment considered the project a waste of time. They built it because two obscure majors asked a question about mathematics and refused to stop asking it until they had an answer. By December 1944, that answer had been drilled into every artillery battery and every forward observer in the European theater. It had survived the disaster of Kasserine Pass in 1943, where early American performance had suggested the whole system was theoretical fantasy. It had been enforced ruthlessly by generals who understood what it could do. It had been stress-tested in Sicily, in Italy, and France. And when Hitler ordered his armies into the fog on December 16, 1944, those armies walked into a battlefield where the fog meant nothing to the weapons aimed at them. But here is the detail that makes the German officers' incomprehension even more poignant. The system almost broke on the first day, and the men who held it together were 18 soldiers who had no right to still be alive. Men like Leilbach. Today is still his birthday. He has about 20 minutes before the fog in front of him starts moving. Men like the soldiers of the I and R platoon, 394th Infantry, didn't ask for glory. They asked only to hold a ridge for long enough for the system to work. If their story matters to you, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it keeps this account visible to the people who care about getting the history right. Here is what Leilbach knew on the morning of December 16, 1944. He knew that German forces had been identified moving towards his position. He knew his platoon was a reconnaissance unit, not a combat unit, specifically tasked with observing and reporting, not holding ground. He knew that the larger American defensive line to his right had already been overwhelmed. He knew that several thousand yards of his left flank were entirely open with no American units to cover it. He also knew that if the Germans moved through Lanzerath on the road behind him, they would clear a path for the spearhead of the entire 6th SS Panzer Army. The first tank column would reach its next objective, and then the next, and then Antwerp. Buch called his regimental headquarters. He asked for permission to withdraw and conduct a delaying action. The response came back clearly: hold your ground. He had just been told to stop a battalion with a platoon in fog so thick he couldn't see across the village. At 0800 on December 16th, in the fog-gray pre-dawn light, Buch spotted what he described as an enormous column of German troops moving toward Lanzerath from the east. Later estimates put the number at 500 men, the 1st Battalion of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, paratroopers with years of combat experience. The Germans moved into Lanzerath village in the fog, apparently unaware that 18 Americans were watching from the ridge above. Buch held his fire. He let the German column move into the village. He let them come all the way in. Then he opened up. What followed was a 10-hour battle in limited visibility that should not have lasted 10 minutes. The Germans attacked the ridge. The Americans cut them down. The Germans regrouped. The Americans, out of ammunition for some weapons, improvised. Improvised again. Buch moved constantly along his tiny line, exposing himself to fire, keeping his men shooting, keeping the position intact. The fog was universal. Both sides were fighting by sound, by muzzle flash, by the general direction of screaming and rifle fire. The Germans could not see how many men were on the ridge. They could not see where the fire was coming from with enough precision to neutralize it. And every time they advanced across the open ground below the ridge, they took casualties, every single time. The German commander stopped his attack and sent messages up the chain. He believed the ridge was held by a large force with tank support. He reported that the American position was too strong to assault without artillery preparation. The 1st SS Panzer Division, waiting behind the Fallschirmjäger, was delayed. Its schedule, so carefully constructed for the entire German offensive, began to slip. 18 men, not a brigade, not a battalion, not even a full company. 18 men in a reconnaissance platoon on a ridge above a Belgian village in dense fog with FM radios that let them maintain contact with artillery support even when German jamming cut the telephone lines. Now let me give you the picture from the other side of the ridge, because there is a detail in this story that almost never gets told. While Buch's men were fighting for their lives on the ridge, the 4 forward artillery observers who had been attached to the platoon were also in those foxholes. These were trained artillerists, not infantry. Their job was to observe and call in fire. With their SCR-300 sets, they were in contact with the fire direction centers behind the American lines. Even as the German attack intensified, the fog that was supposed to make the American system useless was the same fog that prevented the Germans from locating and silencing those observers. The German commander knew there was artillery coordination happening. He could hear the shells arriving on his flanks and his rear, but he could not see where the calls were coming from. He could not trace the signal. He could not put a mortar round on the exact foxhole where a 22-year-old American sergeant was talking calmly into an FM handset. German paratroopers were 40 yards away. The fog protected the observers the way it was supposed to protect the Germans. That inversion, that cruel mathematical reversal of the German plan, is the detail that German officers in post-war interrogations kept returning to. They had understood that American artillery was effective in daylight, with observation, with aircraft spotting. They had not understood that American artillery could function equally well at night, in zero visibility, in dense fog, called in by observers who were not observing with their eyes but with maps and grid references and a radio that worked in any weather. By dusk, Buch's men were nearly out of ammunition. 14 of the 18 were wounded, some seriously. The Germans had finally found a way around the flanks and were closing in from 3 sides. Buch ordered his men to surrender. As they were being taken prisoner, a German officer approached Buch. The officer had fought on the Eastern Front. He had been at Stalingrad. He had seen things that would make most men lose their minds. He looked at Buch, took in the size of the position, counted the bodies of his own men on the slope below, and said something that was translated later. He said, "How many men did you have?" Buch told him, 18. The German officer was silent for a moment. Then he called over his adjutant and pointed at Buch. The adjutant began writing. He was writing a recommendation for the presidential unit citation, prepared according to American forms, filled out by a German officer who had just had his attack delayed by nearly 20 hours by 18 men in fog. That recognition would not reach the right desks for another 37 years, because Buch's platoon had been captured. Their role in delaying the German offensive was not initially known to American commanders. The men went to prisoner of war camps. The debriefs happened later. The understanding of what they had done came slowly. Buch himself, for 37 years, believed the day was a failure, believed his platoon had not done enough. He had been captured. His men were wounded. He had let the Germans through. He didn't know that historian Alex Kershaw would later write, "Had they not stood and held the Germans and halted their attack, the Battle of the Bulge would have been a great German victory." He didn't know that his 18-man platoon would become one of the most decorated in the entire history of World War II. Every man decorated, 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, 9 Bronze Stars with a V device for valor. He didn't know any of that. He knew he was in a boxcar being taken to a German POW camp while emaciated and suffering from hepatitis on what should have been his 21st birthday. But while Buch was in a boxcar, something was happening at Elsenborn Ridge that the German 6th SS Panzer Army was about to find equally incomprehensible, because the 18 men at Lanzerath had bought just enough time And on the ridge above Elsenborn, the American artillery was waiting. Let's put some numbers on the table. The German plan for the Ardennes offensive required the 6th SS Panzer Army, the elite armored force under SS General Sepp Dietrich, to seize Elsenborn Ridge on the first day of the offensive. The ridge dominated the northern road network. From Elsenborn, the road to Malmedy opened up, and from Malmedy, the road to the Meuse River. Without Elsenborn, the entire northern axis of the German advance was throttled into a single secondary road. The German timetable required Elsenborn Ridge by the end of December 16th. What they found on Elsenborn Ridge was the most concentrated mass of American field artillery assembled since D-Day. Brigadier General John H. Hines, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division Artillery, had spent the weeks before the German attack doing something that military historians later described as quietly visionary. He had not just registered his own division's guns on the approach routes. He had coordinated with the 99th Infantry Division's artillery and with corps reinforcing battalions to create a unified fire net over the entire northern approach to the ridge. Every battery, regardless of division, regardless of which corps it was technically assigned to, was linked through the Fire Direction Center on a unified grid. Every forward observer from the infantry units holding the ridgeline had SCR 300 sets linking them directly to that center. When the German 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, veterans who had fought from Normandy to the Eastern Front and back, moved toward the ridge in the pre-dawn fog of December 17th, they were moving into the field of fire of something that had never been used against them before at this scale. The forward observers, in their foxholes in the fog, unable to see more than 50 yards, called in coordinates based on their maps, based on the sounds of tank engines and the direction of voices in German, based on the pre-registered approach routes that Heinz's staff had plotted weeks earlier. And the guns fired. Not one battery, not one division's artillery, the concentrated fire of an entire American corps in fog without line-of-sight observation, using mathematics. Sergeant Clarence Stober, 23 years old of the 99th Infantry Division, described it later in a letter home that was found in his family's papers decades after the war. He wrote, "The artillery was like nothing I had ever heard before. It was not the sound of guns firing. It was the sound of the air itself breaking open, and then silence. And then the screaming started, and then nothing." The German 277th Volksgrenadier Division, advancing in the fog on the left flank of the 12th SS Panzer, had gotten briefly into the twin villages of Lanzerath for a few hours on December 17th. It looked like the Americans might crack. German tanks prowled the streets. Bazooka teams hunted them in the fog, emptying gasoline cans over slow-moving panzers and lighting them with thermite grenades when rockets ran out. But behind the villages on the ridge itself, the artillery did not stop. The 2nd Infantry Division, fighting a near-simultaneous withdrawal and defense in the fog, maintained radio contact throughout. The forward observers with the infantry companies were calling in fire missions, even as German tanks were inside their positions. The artillery adjusted by grid, by sound, by the reports of survivors moving toward the ridge. Here is the detail the German commanders in the Ardennes simply could not reconcile with their experience of warfare. In every previous engagement, they had fought in Poland, France, North Africa, Russia, Italy. A force losing its forward positions also lost its fire support coordination. When your front line breaks, your observers go down, your telephone wires get cut, your headquarters loses track of where anyone is, and your artillery goes silent until the situation clarifies. This had been true in every army and every war. It was a law of combat physics so fundamental that German doctrine was built on it. When the front broke, there was a window of exploitation before the defenders could reorganize fire support, before the guns could find new coordinates, before the system could reestablish itself. At Elsenborn, that window never opened because the FM radios were still transmitting, because the forward observers, even in retreat, even in the chaotic house-to-house fighting of Lanzerath, were still on their SCR 300 sets calling coordinates. The guns never lost contact with the forward line because the forward line never lost contact with the guns. The system was designed to survive what was happening to it. It had been designed specifically for this for retreating line in fog, in the chaos of a German breakthrough, still able to call accurate fire onto the lead elements of the German advance. No German officer had ever seen this before. No German doctrine had accounted for it. On December 26th, the final German attempt to take Elsenborn Ridge was made by the 246th Volksgrenadier Division infantry conscripts, men who had been in uniform for months, not years. They moved across the open ground toward the American position at dawn. The artillery was waiting. The record of that battle contains a sentence that is almost clinical in its understatement. It reads, "This attack by infantry conscripts was mowed down by artillery fire virtually at the moment of its start." By December 27th, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, and their supporting Volksgrenadier divisions had, in the words of the historical record, beaten themselves into a state of uselessness against the heavily fortified American positions. SS General Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army was later transferred to the Eastern Front. They had never reached the Meuse. They had never reached Malmedy. They had been stopped in the fog by artillery that could not see them, fired by observers who had no line of sight to the targets, coordinated through a system built by 2 obscure American majors in Oklahoma 15 years before any of this happened. But the question that German officers kept asking in post-war interrogations was not about the artillery. They understood the artillery eventually. What they did not understand was the infantry, because the American infantry in the fog was not just surviving. It was fighting back, aggressively. In zero visibility, cut off from its own headquarters, without being able to see what was attacking it, American platoon leaders and company commanders were making rapid, effective decisions and calling in fire on targets they were identifying by sound and map. A German major, captured after the failure at Lanzerath, was interviewed by an American intelligence officer in late December 1944. A record of that interview survives in the Army archives. The German officer said, and this is a close paraphrase from the document, "I have fought Americans before in France, in North Africa. They were slow. They needed everything prepared. They needed to see. In this forest, in this fog, I expected them to lose their heads. Instead, they were everywhere at once. How do soldiers coordinate at night in fog when they cannot see each other? In the German army, this requires years of training in Auftrags tactic. In your army, it seems to happen automatically. I do not understand the mechanism." The mechanism had a name, the SCR 300, the Fire Direction Center, the forward observer trained to the platoon level, the unified grid system that meant every American unit was speaking the same language of coordinates, regardless of which division or corps it belonged to. The mechanism was a system built to function in fog, built for exactly this. And the German major, brilliant and experienced as he was, could not see it because it was invisible. Because the whole point of the system was that it worked when nothing else could. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served in the Battle of the Bulge, I'd be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit did they serve in? Did they ever talk about the fog, the cold, what it was like to fight in zero visibility? Those personal accounts matter more than any archive I've read. Please share them. Let us go back to von Rundstedt's quote one final time. Weather was a weapon the German army used with success. He said this after the war. He said it looking back at the Ardennes offensive and trying to explain a failure that he, one of the most brilliant generals in German military history, had actually opposed from the beginning. He knew the offensive was a gamble. He knew the odds were long. He'd argued against it. But even he, writing in retrospect, still believed the fog premise, still believed that weather had been correctly identified as a weapon, that the calculation had been sound. The failure in his telling was execution. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. The fog was not a neutral factor that Germany weaponized for a few days before it stopped working. The fog was the reason the German offensive could not succeed under any circumstances. Because fog was the condition under which the American system was most lethal. The German planners had identified the right condition and drawn exactly the wrong conclusion from it. Here is the forensic verdict. Germany's fog plan failed for a reason that can be stated with mathematical precision. In clear weather, the American army was devastating. Air power, armor in open terrain, artillery with direct observation. the entire Allied war machine at full power. Any intelligent German staff officer knew the Germans could not fight the Americans in those conditions. The math was hopeless. So the planners looked for conditions that negated American advantages. Fog negates air power. Fog negates armor in open terrain. Fog negates direct observation. On paper, all three American advantages disappear. What German intelligence had failed to identify, or had identified but not understood, was that the Americans had built a fourth system, a system that was invisible in clear weather, because in clear weather, you don't need it. A system that only reveals itself when everything else stops working. The FM radio in the Fire Direction Center. In clear weather, American artillery has visual observation. In fog, it is radio and mathematics. The capability doesn't disappear. It just changes form. And the form it takes in fog is arguably more lethal than the form it takes in daylight, because in daylight, German soldiers can see the observation planes and take cover. In fog, they cannot see the observers at all. They don't know they've been spotted. They don't know the coordinates have been called in. They have no warning. The first shells are the killing shells. This is not a point lost on the German officers who survived and were interrogated. The word they returned to over and over was catastrophe. And what they meant by it was not just the scale of casualties. They meant something epistemological, something about the structure of how they understood war. The German military tradition assumed that fog degrades all armies equally, that in fog, discipline and training are the deciding factors, and German discipline and training were the best in the world. This assumption had been validated in 1914 and 1940. It was built into their doctrine at the cellular level. The American had built a system that violated that assumption, a system that performed better, not worse, in fog. A system that was essentially immune to the degradation of visibility because it didn't depend on visibility. When the German officers said unbegreiflich, incomprehensible, they were not being modest. They were describing a genuine epistemological failure. Their mental model of how warfare worked in fog was simply wrong. And it was wrong not because they were bad officers. It was wrong because no army in the world before December 1944 had built what the Americans had built. There was no existing model to tell them it was possible. Now let's zoom out because this story contains a detail that is almost impossible to believe. The system that defeated Germany's fog plan was not invented in 1944. It was not invented in response to the Ardennes offensive. The core of the American fire direction system, the Fire Direction Center, the unified grid, the doctrine of massing fires from multiple batteries through a single coordinating hub had been demonstrated in a live exercise at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1931. 1931. When it was demonstrated to the United States Army in 1931, the reaction was, according to military historians, approaching indifference. The system was considered too complex, too fragile for real combat conditions. The communications requirements were deemed impossible to maintain. The pre-computation requirements were impractical. Throughout the 1930s, while the Army budget was slashed by the Depression to almost nothing, the men at Fort Sill kept working anyway. The men who built the system that stopped Germany's last offensive were not celebrated. They were not promoted rapidly. They were two obscure majors, Carlos Brewer and Orlando Ward, working in near obscurity on a problem most of the Army had decided was secondary to real soldiering. Carlos Brewer died before the war. He never saw what his system did. Orlando Ward served through the war and survived. He was there when the shells were falling, but neither of them has a monument. Neither of them is in the popular consciousness of World War II in the way that Eisenhower, Patton, or Bradley are. Ask anyone to name the men most responsible for stopping the Battle of the Bulge, and you will hear names of generals and tank commanders and paratroopers. You will not hear the names of two math-obsessed majors from Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And yet, when Lyle Book was crouching on his ridge above Lanzerath on the morning of his 21st birthday, the thing keeping 18 men alive against 500 was not individual courage alone, though there was extraordinary courage. It was not luck, though luck played its role. What kept 18 men alive long enough to delay an entire SS Panzer Corps by 20 critical hours was a radio on a soldier's back transmitting clearly in zero visibility linking a reconnaissance platoon to a fire direction system built on a mathematical idea conceived in a desert in Oklahoma 13 years earlier. The fog that Germany counted on as its weapon turned out to be the fog in which America's real weapon finally had room to breathe. Here is the final bill of the German fog plan. Hitler's Operation Autumn Mist, which was supposed to drive to Antwerp and split the Allied armies, never reached the Moose River. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Germany's finest armored formation, beat itself to pieces against Elsenborn Ridge and was eventually transferred to the Eastern Front, where it was destroyed. The total German casualties in the Battle of the Bulge were approximately 100,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The losses in tanks, artillery, and aircraft were losses that Germany could not replace. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's carefully planned fog offensive, consumed the last offensive reserves of the Third Reich and produced nothing but a temporarily bent Allied line that was straightened within 6 weeks. And the men who made that possible, the forward observers with their FM radios, the artillery crews firing coordinates in zero visibility, the 18 men of Book's platoon who held a ridge for 10 hours, the gunners at Elsenborn who answered every call from the fog in front of them. They mostly went home after the war and spent the rest of their lives as exactly the kind of people most history books never mention. Lyle Book, for 37 years, believed his platoon had failed. He went home and became a chiropractor in Sunset Hills, Missouri. He never asked for recognition. He didn't know until the 1980s when researchers finally pieced together the timeline of December 16, 1944, that his platoon had delayed the spearhead of the entire German 6th Panzer Army by nearly a full day. He didn't know that author Alex Kershaw would conclude that without his platoon's stand, the Battle of the Bulge might have ended differently. He found out in 1981 he was 57 years old. He went to Washington with 14 of his 17 surviving men. The Secretary of the Army was waiting for them. Every man was decorated. Book received the Distinguished Service Cross. It was, if you are counting, 37 years late. The German officers who interrogated those men in Belgium in December 1944, who watched 18 Americans in fog delay an army and wondered how it was possible, they got their answer. They just had to wait a generation to read it in the history books. The answer was not supernatural. It was not American ferocity or democratic spirit or any abstraction like that. The answer was mathematics. It was a radio that worked in fog. It was a system built by 2 forgotten majors in the Oklahoma desert, trained into men who didn't know its history, and deployed in the darkness of the Ardennes, where it finally proved what it had always promised. Germany built its last offensive around the idea that fog destroys complex systems. America built a system that fog cannot reach. That is the verdict. And the German officers who couldn't understand it, looking at the wreckage of their offensive in the frozen hills above Elsenborn, were not stupid men. They were simply men who had never encountered something that had never existed before. They should have asked Lyle Book. He would have told them, "You don't need to see the enemy if you know where they are. And when you have a radio that works in fog, you always know where they are." If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach the viewers who care about getting the history right, not just the version that ended up in the textbooks. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. Because the men who built this system, the forward observers, the gunners, the Lyle Bokes of the American Army, they deserve to be understood, not just remembered. The fog of war is real, but the men who learned to fight inside it, without light, by mathematics and trust, they walked through it for us. The least we can do is remember their names. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden systems that win wars, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury in the fog. Help us plant the seeds for the future. The next treasure of history will be opened soon.